Hi, welcome to Session 9 of Pirates, Smugglers, and the Making of the Modern World. Today we're going to start moving on chronologically. As you've probably noticed through the early weeks of the course, we're focused mostly on the period from about 1500 to 1800 and moved up briefly into the 19th century, mostly to talk about piracy in Asia. But today we're going to really start talking about the 19th century and move into the 20th century, and from here on, after today, everything we talk about is largely going to be about events in the 20th century that have shaped the modern world. Particularly today we're going to look at three things. One is the factors that led to a drastic decrease in smuggling in the world in general, roughly from the period of 1850 down to 1950. In other words, about a 100-year period. What were the major factors that led to a substantial decrease in smuggling? And we can also say piracy in some ways. We saw the subduing of pirates in the Spanish Main back in the 1720s, but some of these same factors play into a reduced presence of pirates around the world in this same period. The second thing we're going to look at are some of the exceptions to this, that, well, yes, piracy and smuggling are generally in decline around the globe in this 100-year period from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century. Nevertheless, we also want to consider what were the exceptions to this. Where were areas that piracy, or particularly smuggling in this case, continued to be of significant impact, and for how long and why. And then in the second half today, we're going to look at one particular exception, and that is prohibition in the United States in the early 20th century, particularly in the 1920s and the early 1930s. This touches on one of the themes that I mentioned last week that we're going to focus on in the last few weeks of the course, and that has to do with smuggling as it pertains to controlled substances. In other words, those products, and we saw this with tobacco and James I in England last week, those substances that a state deems to be dangerous or damaging to the interests of society as a whole, and therefore prohibits or tries to tax in such a way as that they're virtually impossible to acquire. And alcohol becomes one of those in early 20th century America, and we want to look at the specific factors behind that and how people responded. What did this have to do with smuggling? How did it contribute to the rise of notorious figures in the world of organized crime in that period? And how big a role did those people actually play? And more generally, what is the reaction of state systems, the general populace, and smugglers when they're dealing with a situation where they do have a controlled substance? And of course, we're going to come back and look at this in even more detail when we see controlled substances, specifically controlled drugs in the 20th century, where we'll look at both the early history of that phenomena and also its more recent history, particularly here in the United States. So those are the three major things we're going to be looking at today. First of all, the issue of, okay, why does smuggling and piracy decrease to a significant degree from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century? One of the basic reasons why this happens is that beginning in England and then encompassing other parts of the world, roughly from the middle of the 19th century until, at least after the First World War, the world economy shifted significantly towards free trade. Today, there's a lot of talk about globalization and free trade agreements. We have NAFTA, we have the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is designed, an organization designed to reduce tariffs and duties around the world. But actually, in many ways, its accomplishments, this period of opening up trade that we've seen in recent decades, is not as dramatic as what happened back beginning in the middle of the 19th century in England. We've seen in England, for example, that one of the things that happened that encouraged smuggling were what were called the Corn Laws, designed to keep food products produced in England in the domestic market rather than allowing them to be exported, for the simple reason that there was this ongoing fear in many societies at this time that they would run short of food. And of course, that did happen on many occasions in the early modern world, that because of drought, other crop problems, disease, etc., food shortages would occur. So England had operated for some time, for several centuries, on the basis of laws that prohibited or severely restricted the export of basic food products that were produced within England itself. However, in 1846, England takes a major step in a new direction by abolishing the Corn Laws. What it meant was that now food products could be not only exported, but imported freely in and out of England. This was an indication of the growing influence of ideas focused on free trade and comparative advantage. If you're familiar with Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith, who talked about free trade, the idea, or free markets, I should say, the idea that through the individual enterprise of private initiative, the attempts by individuals to initiate businesses and to carry on business, that those initiatives, in their own right, by the work of what Smith deemed this invisible hand, would most significantly benefit the economies of the world. It was best to leave entrepreneurs to themselves, as unshackled by state interference as possible, in order to achieve maximum economic growth and the maximum benefit for the economy and the population. And of course, David Ricardo's ideas about comparative advantage. In line with this, the idea that each economy should produce those goods which it was most capable of, most efficient in producing, and trade for those goods which it was less efficient in producing. In the case of England, England is now well into its industrial revolution, and the idea is they are most efficient at producing industrial goods, therefore they should trade those for farm products and for other products that England may be less efficient at producing. Exchange in the world market will be to both their advantage and the advantage of others who produce such products more efficiently than the British do. So the abolition of the Corn Laws is one of the first significant steps in this direction of bringing down tariff barriers and opening up a process of free trade. Now, it has to be said that there is more than just people being sold on ideas from Smith and Ricardo. These ideas had been around a while. In many ways, England's promotion of free trade is really a winner's philosophy or a winner's policy, meaning this, that by this time that these changes start to come about in the middle of the 19th century, England had established itself as the preeminent economic power in the world. It was the first country to advance significantly in terms of the development of an industrial base, to experience a full-fledged industrial revolution. It was often called the workshop of the world because it was the leading industrial power, certainly during the 19th and into the early decades of the 20th century. Furthermore, along with that industrial power had come considerable influence and significance in other ways. For example, 1/3 of all the seagoing vessels in the world at this time were British, meaning it had an enormous naval and even more importantly mercantile fleet. In addition to that, London had become the financial capital of the world, much like New York has held that position through much of the 20th and early 21st century. This is where the major financial dealings of the world took place. England was the dominant financial power, mercantile power, naval power, industrial power. In other words, if you looked at the world economy as a hierarchy, England was clearly at that pinnacle, and no one was even running a close second at this time when it came to overall economic power. What that meant was that, of course, the British could envision only benefits from this process, since they felt that they could produce more cheaply industrial goods, had more financial power than anyone else. Then opening free trade with just about any part of the world to them was bound to bring enormous advantages. They were going to win in any free trade situation because they had such enormous leads in most areas of economics over the other countries in the world. It's also needless to say that many countries that were England's competitors at this time, Germany, France, the United States, weren't exactly going to fall all over themselves rushing to adopt these same free trade policies. Now in time, as their industrial bases grew, as they became increasingly competitive, they would open their economies to a degree, and become more free trade oriented. And this was a significant impact during the course of the second half of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. But of course, it wasn't going to happen all at once, because these countries well knew that Britain's promotion of free trade was largely designed to benefit Britain. So it would be a gradual process, but then other parts of the world would be more open to this idea. Areas like Latin America, where the British ideas about accelerating economic growth, both in England and in its trading partners, caught on very quickly. In Latin America, where you have economies that at this time produce largely primary goods, agricultural products, whether it was sugar, coffee, wheat, etc., and mineral products, mining products like copper, etc., there seemed to be a natural match here. This seemed to be the sort of prototypical comparative advantage that David Ricardo had talked about, that Latin American countries could most efficiently produce primary products, England could most efficiently produce industrial products. Here we will both benefit and prosper from this exchange of goods in a free trade world. So it's based on this logic that England now moves down the road quickly towards a free trade economy. In 1850, there is the end of export duties, and we've seen that export duties on wool, etc., had been in place for centuries, with the idea that the Crown would secure considerable revenues from England's most important export products. So these are essentially abandoned in 1850, that there is more to be gained in the economy and even for state revenues by getting rid of those export duties, which can only impede the sale of English goods in other parts of the world. There is also the continuing abolition of import duties on products being brought into the country. Now, as I've listed here on the slide, there are exceptions that are made in the case of import duties. Most of these, as you will see, would be things that would be considered luxury goods, lace, etc. And then those products that are considered, well, sort of items that are commonly attached to a sin tax. In other words, these are products that represent habits of people like alcohol and tobacco, which are not considered to be very positive in terms of their use, so why not go ahead and impose a duty on them, or maintain the duties, I should say. At the same time, of course, tobacco continued to carry this onus that it was indeed sort of an evil product, and it remained one of those products right into the 20th and 21st centuries on which there are extremely heavy import duties, and not surprisingly, smuggling would continue in the area of tobacco. But a wide array of, if we couldn't list the hundreds and hundreds of other products that are now imported into England essentially duty-free. This was a pretty narrow list, pretty exceptional list of items that still had to pay taxes as they were brought into the British economy. Another thing that happens is that because of this, in part, because of the lowering of the duties, there is a change in public attitudes towards smuggling. At one time, and for indeed a number of centuries, people who were smuggling goods in England, as we saw last week, were often looked upon as sort of folk heroes, community heroes, because they were helping people acquire goods such as tea that the government had imposed enormous duties on, that the government maintained private monopolies on, so that people looked upon a smuggler as somebody who simply, it's like, well, they're running, sort of the modern version of Walmart. Why should I worry about what they happen to be doing? Because what I know is I can go and get products there at a much lower price than I can elsewhere. Well, that's the way many people viewed smugglers during the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in England. But now, as the duties come down, as the price differentials are reduced, smugglers are less likely to be seen in that kind of positive light. And we will see that part of this is also the fact that because of improvements in the bureaucracy, because of a more honest and efficient administration of the customs system, there is less of a sense that, well, everyone's doing something illegal with imports, whether it's taking bribes at the customs house or smuggling. Why should I worry about the fact that I'm buying smuggled goods or supporting people who smuggle goods? The fact that the system becomes more efficient and more honest encourages the public to look upon this as more of a criminal activity, smuggling of goods, than they had in the past. There are changes in the customs service as well. Some of this we saw last week when we talked about the fact that over time, by the end of the 18th, but particularly by the beginning of the 19th century, the English government has begun to improve the customs service, hiring people more on the basis of ability and less on the basis of who they know. There was less in the way of nepotism, the hiring of friends, relatives, etc., people in the government, and there are improvements in salaries. These kinds of improvements that had already begun to take place in the late 18th and early 19th century are confirmed by the middle of the 19th century. In 1853, the English government passes the Customs Act, and this formalized what had been incremental change in the past in terms of requiring the hiring of individuals based on ability and the payment of reasonable salaries to the some 10,000 people who are now part of the customs service. The government went even further 3 years later when it imposed the civil service system on the customs service. What this meant was that we now have a much more regulated system by which people are hired based on their abilities and a more regularized system by which their pay is increased. Specifically, while there will always remain some nepotism, there was always some in virtually every bureaucratic system, nevertheless, people who are admitted into the customs service, who are hired to take these positions, must now either pass an exam, demonstrate a certain educational level, or specific documented experience that qualifies them for their positions, just as you have in contemporary bureaucracies. So here in the middle of the 19th century in England, we're seeing the emergence of truly modern bureaucracies where you really require that people meet a set of objective standards first to be admitted in to service in the government, and then secondly, for purposes of promotion and pay increases, that they're also going to have to meet certain standards, that they are indeed evaluated, or they will have to pass proficiency tests, etc., in order to receive pay increases. All of this makes for a more efficient customs service, one that is less open to corruption, one that is more able to enforce the laws. So we've got a combination of decreasing smuggling because price differentials are going down, and at the same time they're getting better at actual enforcement itself because they're improving the bureaucracy. At the same time, the change in public attitudes also allowed the government, beginning in this period, to allow local officials to seize smuggled goods. In the past, given the fact that, of course, people were being bribed left and right, and given the fact that local juries would often not find a smuggler guilty, this was always a high-risk proposition, and it was left largely in the hands of customs officials. But now, as bureaucratic efficiency improves, as the modern state emerges, so too can the modern state now, through more efficient officials at the local level, use them in addition to people officially assigned to the customs service to seize smuggled goods. So this means there are more people now that you can utilize in the ports and elsewhere to enforce the laws, and again, they face less traffic that is smuggled, so all in all, it's a far more efficient system. In 1873, one other step that's taken is the inclusion of steam launches, in other words, steam-powered vessels that are largely used along the coast and in river inlets to pursue smugglers. The importance of this is mostly the fact that with steam power, it means that these vessels can more easily navigate in and out of the waters because, of course, they don't have to worry about the wind at any given moment, and they can also be on patrol on a regular basis no matter what the wind conditions are. They can be out there essentially 24 hours a day, short of extreme weather, pursuing smugglers and tracking them down. So this is another technological step. And what it speaks to in a larger sense is that what we have emerging in England, but we also have emerging elsewhere in the world, in Germany and France, Germany, France, Holland, the United States, Japan, are modern state systems with modern bureaucracies and with a command of technologies such as steam power that are going to make them more efficient in tracking down smuggling in general, improve telecommunications, etc. State systems are greatly enhanced in their ability to control populations, to control economic activity, than any of the early modern states that preceded them. We have largely done away with the feudal rights of individuals, the pockets of independent power that existed under the Tudors and Stuarts, the monarchs of England back in the 1500s, 1600s, and beyond. Much of this has been eliminated, and more we see emerging, not only in England, but in many countries in the world, modern state systems that have enormous power, enormous control compared to their predecessors over their people, over their economies, and have command of considerable technologies that can be used, for example, to wipe out smugglers. Another factor that plays into the decrease in smuggling and piracy during this period is a changing world economy. By the middle of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution is clearly well advanced in England, well on its way in France and Holland, rapidly advancing in Germany and the United States, and beginning in Japan. And all of these countries, by the early 20th century, can count themselves as significant industrial powers in the world. Now, the Industrial Revolution has a variety of impacts, as we know. One, of course, is this extraordinary ability to produce material goods at levels and at efficiencies that people would not have been able to imagine even 100 years earlier. So we have this enormous outpouring of industrial products. A second factor that is a product, in part, of the Industrial Revolution is population explosions, particularly in large cities. Now, part of this is the simple fact that because industry largely develops in the larger urban areas, people move from the rural areas into urban areas seeking jobs in industry. That's where jobs are being created at this time. So part of it is simply population movement from rural areas into cities. But in addition to that, the Industrial Revolution, partly by improving transportation, as we will see, increases populations in general because of the more efficient movement of food products. Whereas in past centuries, let's say in the 18th century in Europe or in Asia, thousands of people might starve in a given region because there was a drought in a given year. And although there was food available in other parts of Europe or Asia at this time, the inability to easily move that product from where it was to where it was needed would lead to mass starvation. Those kinds of problems were being reduced by more efficient movement of food products as a result of the Industrial Revolution and its impact upon transportation. And that leads to the next point, which is the transportation revolution, the development of new technologies that vastly improve the transportation of goods. Clipper ships, steamships, railroads, these are key elements in that process, particularly the railroads. And clipper ships with these multi-sail, vastly increased in size and speed, ocean-going vessels dramatically improve the ability to deliver products around the world. Same with steamships, although steamships aren't known for being much faster than sail vessels, depending on weather conditions. The fact is they can keep moving constantly no matter what the wind conditions are. And as far as railroads, with railroads you get literally a 2/3 reduction in the cost of transporting goods. If you've been moving goods by animal, horse-drawn cart on the backs of mules or camels, you can literally cut your transportation costs, your shipment costs by 2/3 if you're using a railroad. So there's this vast improvement in the cost of transporting goods, and in this case, in particular, where it was most costly, and that was across land. Now, part of this is, of course, a product of the Industrial Revolution, that some of these technologies, particularly railroads, are made possible by the production of iron, steel, etc. The other side of it is it also means that the Industrial Revolution can advance more rapidly because the goods that are produced can be moved more rapidly around the world. And in particular, in the 19th century, we see the rapid explosion of what was called plantation systems. In other words, large commercial agricultural institutions that produce usually a single product for export. Sugar plantations, coffee plantations, palm oil plantations. Now, of course, there have been plantations for centuries. However, the difference is that we get a vast expansion of this plantation system in the 19th century as the opportunity arises to produce massive amounts of foodstuffs and agricultural industrial product, cotton, for example, that goes into the textile industry. There's a vast new opportunity because the enormous expansion in industry that needs these inputs and in the huge growth in populations, especially in urban areas, that need to be fed. So plantations are exploding in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. You can count the great wheat estates in Russia as part of the same process as these opportunities are created to push huge amounts of agricultural products and what I call agrarian inputs into industry into the major industrial countries. The other side of this is that, well, we call it a plantation system. We can also count within it the significant outposts for mining production in the world, North and South America, again, Africa and parts of Asia. We have the opening up of enormous mining enterprises to extract iron ore, extract copper, and other products that are used in the production of industrial goods. They become a part of this same system and affect the lives of millions of people around the world as this plantation system explodes. Now, you may ask, okay, what does all this got to do with smuggling? Well, then that's a nice little reprise of the Industrial Revolution. Well, the importance for us of these changes in terms of talking about piracy and smuggling is the change that it brought about in world trade. It led to the emergence in a predominant fashion of certain new products. And when you look at the list here, you'll immediately say, so what's new about coffee, sugar, etc., cotton? These have been around for centuries, and that's absolutely true. The reason I use the term new in describing these products is that because now, for the first time, they could be shipped in mass quantities around the globe, whether across the ocean or over land surfaces. Now, world trade was going to take on a very different content. When we look back at trading empires, where we began the course, looking at the Ottoman Empire, Spain, Portugal, etc., almost inevitably, the key to these trading empires was trade in precious cargoes, goods that are high value per unit. Silver, gold, spices, silks, etc. Because these were the only products that were really viable in terms of global trade at this time. Ships, even in the 18th century, are perhaps 120, 140 feet long. How much cargo can they carry? You cannot carry huge amounts of bulk product. It just doesn't make sense. You're not going to make any money shipping a 100-foot vessel loaded with cotton from, let's say, the American South to Europe. The value is just not there. But as you radically reduce the cost of transportation, suddenly those products become highly viable. They become, in fact, the dominant elements of world trade. This 90% figure that I have down here for trade, what it means is that if we take the new agricultural products, the plantation products that I've got listed here, like cotton, sugar, etc., and add to that the industrial products that are being shipped in the world. In other words, as England and Germany and the United States and others send steel rails and locomotives and boilerplate and all the rest of it around the world, if we take these industrial goods and add to it the agricultural products that are being shipped, we come up with 90% of the world's trade by the late 19th century. In other words, 9 times out of 10, if you are a pirate and you want to attack a vessel that's sailing on the ocean, 9 times out of 10, what you're going to find it stuffed with is industrial goods or one of these agricultural products from the plantation system. Problem is, this is not a very high value good. This is not the kind of thing, well, we'll grab a couple of bales of cotton and head off in our own ship and be on our way and make a fortune. A couple of bales of cotton just isn't going to cut it. The problem for pirates becomes, where are the targets of opportunity anymore if by far and away 90% of the world's trade is consisting of bulk products like cotton, like steel rails. And if you're a smuggler, the same issue comes up. First of all, you've got spreading free trade, so duty barriers are being reduced. But even if you're not dealing with that problem, how efficient is it to try to smuggle a shipload of cotton somewhere? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. It's difficult to do, to get it past people, unless you've been able to totally corrupt the customs system. And the profits just aren't going to be there for these bulk goods. They're too difficult to move around. So the simple changing nature of international trade, it's very content changing, has dramatic impact on what smugglers and pirates can do. What are the targets of opportunity? There are still some there, of course, as we will see, but many of the targets are disappearing because the primary goods in world trade now are not these precious goods of silver, gold, spices, and so on. They are instead these bulk products of the Industrial Revolution of the 19th and early 20th centuries. In addition to what we've already looked at, spreading free trade and the improvements in the modern state bureaucracy and changes in the content of world trade, there is also the fact that Great Britain emerges at this time as, by far and away, the dominant world power, able to exercise, much as the United States does today, a power and influence over much of the globe, not only because of its economic, but also because of its military capabilities. This means that the British in particular are able to influence events in far distant locations and at least make a significant advance towards enforcing rules against smuggling and piracy. They become increasingly involved, for example, in doing this in places like the coast of China. We saw a little bit of that when we looked at Asian pirates back at the beginning of the 19th century, but that power is going to increase over time. The other complementary phenomena is the development of colonialism. From the middle of the 19th century until 1913, till we get to the outbreak of World War I, England, Germany, France in particular, the Dutch are also involved, but those are the major powers that become involved in acquiring vast territories around the globe, particularly Africa. Africa during the second half of the 19th century is essentially carved up by the British, the French, and the Germans mostly into a series of colonial holdings that they possess. They exercise similar kinds of controls over Southeast Asia. They also come to dominate the coastal territories of China, etc. These are areas, again, where now they can exercise the powers of the modern state directly over large parts of the population of the world and over their economies. I mean, Britain alone in this period increases the population that it controls by 63 million people, increases the territory that it controls by 4 million square miles. So you have this enormous process by which much of the world is brought under the direct control of a handful of European powers who then, although not nearly as efficiently as at home, but nevertheless can extend the powers of the modern state into these regions. As we will see, their effects are most limited in these colonial regions, but nevertheless they are able to start to enforce these controls in terms of opposing smuggling and piracy in other parts of the globe. So all of these factors, but particularly the first three that I mentioned, the rise of free trade, the increased powers of modern states, and the changing composition of world trade in general. These are the three that have the greatest impact on reducing piracy and smuggling between the middle of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Now, there are factors that play against this at the same time. Not everything is moving on the side of ending smuggling and piracy, and as I've mentioned any number of times, there is really no period in history where you can really say, well, except for maybe very early ancient times, when you can say, look, this is a period with virtually no piracy or smuggling. But this is definitely a period in which there's been a dramatic increase. But there are factors that are going to help keep, particularly smuggling, a lively activity in significant parts of the world, and we're going to look at some of those exceptions. First of all, one of the places we're going to look at is China. And here, interestingly enough, in a rather apparently contradictory process, England will come and enforce, from what it sees as its perspective, rules of free trade upon China. What those enforcements of free trade ideas will do, and we'll see there's a lot more to it than simple principles of free trade, but what England's activities in China will do in terms of promoting free trade will actually encourage the drug trade in China, indeed cause it to flourish in this period in the 19th century, and not surprisingly, the drug trade almost anywhere in the world is going to wind up being a smuggler's trade, because in China, as in other societies, of course, the use of products like opium, the specific one we're going to talk about in the case of China, is prohibited. So naturally, no matter what the British do, there is going to be a basic prohibition against this product, and that's going to encourage smuggling. So, in an apparent contradiction, the British go and promote free trade. In China, what that leads to is actually a vast increase in smuggling. Why? We'll see why in a moment, but part of it has to do with the fact that what they want to have free trade in is opium. A second case where smuggling remains significant is the smuggling of human beings and slavery in Africa. We will see that this remains a problem through most of the 19th century, although here there is a dramatic decrease in problems resulting from the slave trade during the 19th century. But nonetheless, at least as of the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, the smuggling of human beings remained an acutely serious problem in Africa. And of course, it remained that problem because Africa was the target of those who wanted to acquire and use slaves in the Western Hemisphere, in the Middle East, and in India, for example. So this will be a continuing problem, although we will see a substantial decrease by the time we get to the end of the 19th century. Another problem that comes up is the general conditions in Africa at this time. That Africa is in the process of being dismantled, dismembered by the European powers as they carve it up into a series of colonies. Before that process began, and indeed even as it continues, there is acute social disintegration in African societies. Part of that is due to the problem of the slave trade to begin with. That the slave trade, of course, was highly disruptive to societies. When people are hunting each other to take each other as slaves, needless to say, large numbers of people are going to engage in battle against each other, and others, millions of people, are going to flee from their homelands trying to escape the treacheries of the slave marketeers. So there is deep disruption in African society at this time, and not surprisingly, indeed, we're going to see similar conditions in much of the world in the second half of the 20th century, that when there is significant social disintegration, when political systems are coming apart, naturally the opportunities from smuggling suddenly explode. Take a late 20th century example. When the Soviet Union falls in 1989, as we will see near the end of the course, one of the things that happens is an explosive growth in smuggling across Eurasia, particularly in the states that constituted the Soviet Union, because suddenly centralized control is gone and smuggling abounds across this vast territory and among populations that mount into the hundreds of millions. Why? Because political order has disintegrated. There is social chaos. Smuggling will flourish in those circumstances. It did too in Africa. We will see the particular product that was involved here in a moment, because we're not talking at this point about slaves, about human cargo. We're talking about another element in this process. There is one other factor that becomes significant at this time, although I'm not going to focus on it today, because we'll come back to it in another epoch, namely the second half of the 20th century, and that is the mass movement of people and the developing of petty smuggling. Now, in terms of the mass movement of individuals, we've just looked at changes in transportation. And we have seen, of course, the vastly improved ability of transportation systems, both by sea and by land, by ship and by rail, to move large bulk cargoes. Well, not to be too crude, but that's what human beings are. They're a large bulk cargo. Now, large numbers of people can move vast distances at relatively inexpensive prices. Now, at this time, we're not talking about, people taking a weekend in Jamaica or something. What we're talking about mostly are people who are emigrating. The people can now emigrate in large numbers across much of the surface of the globe. Their migrations are now going to increase tremendously in number and speed. If you think of the history of this country, but indeed it's the same history for the entire Western Hemisphere, from Canada to the United States, down to countries like Argentina and Brazil, from the middle of the 19th century well into the 20th century, at least up until the First World War, depending on the country, there is this enormous influx, millions and millions of people coming primarily from Europe and from the Eurasian continent, who are pouring into the Western Hemisphere. Partly, of course, because of desperate conditions often in their own systems, but most importantly because they can now afford to do this. Maybe the only time they can go. It's not like some Irish or Italian immigrant is going to sail back and visit mom and dad every couple of years because he won't be able to afford it. But on the other hand, people can afford, in terms of permanent migration, to make this vast movement across the Atlantic Ocean, and in some cases the Pacific Ocean. What we have suddenly are large numbers of people moving rapidly across international borders. And not surprisingly, that will also encourage many of them to take on a little bit of smuggling on the side. Now, when I talk about petty smuggling, I don't mean the kind of thing that happens today when you fly in, you're flying back to the United States from somewhere, and they give you a customs declaration, and they say, well, the maximum is $500 or whatever it is today, and you have to list, what you've purchased, and you realize that, well, gee, it's really $600, but I'll tell them it's $495. That way I won't have to pay anything. A little bit of cheating on the side. That kind of thing is truly trivial. What we're talking about is slightly more upscale, one step up from that, where someone says, well, I can buy 10 Rolex watches here, and I don't have to pay any import duty, and I can sell them off at a nifty little profit when I get home, so I'm deliberately going to, pack about 10, 20 Rolex watches in my suitcase and just keep my fingers crossed that they won't look and I'll get away with it. That kind of thing where you're making a conscious effort, but it's not, you've not become a professional smuggler by any means. This kind of smuggling, to make a bit of profit, that becomes endemic in this era in the second half of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, because millions upon millions of people are making these moves across international borders, much of it for the purpose of immigration. This creates these opportunities for smuggling of this kind. We will see as we get to the second half of the 20th century that this process accelerates dramatically, not because of immigration necessarily, although that's still a significant factor, but simply the element of tourism, that tens of millions of people are moving every year across much of the globe simply for purposes of vacation. And along the way, a lot of them are going to smuggle. And besides that, a lot of professional smugglers, we will see in this later epoch, will take advantage of that fact to use the tourist trade as a way of smuggling goods as well. But this is the first time in the modern era when it starts to become a problem, this sort of petty smuggling that's going on, and it's going on largely because of the large numbers of people that are emigrating, and obviously there's a question of traffic control. How many people can you actually inspect the luggage of if you've got millions of people pouring into a port over a series of a few years. But we'll look at that down the road a bit. I mention it now because we want to look at this in its historical development. But this is the period in which it becomes a problem. Before we get to that, there were far more serious problems in terms of smuggling, even in this era when, in general, smuggling is on a decline. And in particular, we want to look at one that will become, again, a theme that we're coming back to in the next few weeks, and that is the drug trade. In China, the consumption of opium, largely by smoking it, had become a significant problem beginning in really the 17th century, although people disagree on when it becomes a significant problem. Generally, it's accepted that it was Europeans visiting China, coming for purposes of trade, who brought opium from other areas of Asia. It was being produced in particular at this time in northeastern parts of the Indian subcontinent, between there and Burma, what was called Burma at one time. That this product was being brought to China during this period by Europeans and began to become a significant problem. It is an addictive drug, and it has a tendency to make people very lackadaisical, reduces their energy levels, and its effects were clearly observed by the imperial government in China, and there was an ongoing ban against the trade and consumption of opium, although through much of this period, depending upon which emperor we're talking about, enforcement tended to be lax. And large numbers of the Chinese population, and we're talking about percentages, if we worry about less than 1% of the American public be involved in the use of drugs other than marijuana. Here we're starting to talk about 3, 4, 5, 6% and more as we go on in time. This was becoming a truly serious problem in Chinese society by the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries. And the Chinese government begins to make strenuous efforts to enforce the ban on drugs, ban on opium specifically. Now, the ban was somewhat easier to enforce in part because China had very restrictive trade policies at this time. Over the course of its history, China had varied in its dealings with Europeans from the time they first arrived in the 16th century down to the beginnings of the 19th century. Generally speaking, the Chinese emperors looked down upon most other societies, and certainly the Europeans. Their perspective was that these were inferior cultures and civilizations, and that they really didn't have much that China wanted and needed. And that was generally true. I mean, most of the products that the Europeans would bring in earlier centuries were cheap manufactured goods, textiles, for example, that paled in comparison to the quality of what the Chinese could bring. A little hard to put a British clay pot up against, a fine piece of Chinese pottery, a Ming vase or something, and say, well, we've got a deal here. So generally the attitude and the reality was that the Chinese wanted little from Europeans, found some of the things that they had kind of interesting, but not on a basis for widespread and valuable trade. As a result of that, and also partly the sense that the Europeans tended to be disruptive. And a good example, and I think we've talked about this a bit, were the Portuguese. When the Portuguese came and started firing off cannon and demanding certain trading opportunities and intimidating Chinese officials in the port areas, they were banned from the country. And in general, it was felt that the Europeans tended to be highly aggressive. Another problem was that, well, early Christian missionaries there, particularly the Jesuits, took a fairly flexible attitude towards conversion of the Chinese population, meaning that when they received a conversion of a Chinese citizen, they were quite flexible about the fact that that Chinese citizen might retain beliefs such as ancestor worship. Well, they tended to be flexible. As time went on, as we got into the 18th century, there was less such flexibility shown. Conversion to Christianity meant abandoning all other religious beliefs, cultural practices, and this was highly offensive and also seen as potentially destabilizing by the Chinese regime. And as a result, particularly by the 18th century, there were bans put on foreign trade in general in China, as we've seen, but also specifically on Europeans. By the early 19th century, however, there is some trade, but on a highly controlled basis. All trade was to go through the port of Canton. It was only to occur during a few months called the trading season. It can only be done by European merchants dealing with a select group of Chinese merchants. So this was a highly limited and short-term process on an annual basis. Now, despite those limitations, opium was flowing in to China at this time, particularly as a result of the efforts of the British East India Company. The British East India Company, as we've seen in the past, we saw this with the tea in Boston and so forth, does hold this monopoly on trade in Asia, and one of the monopolies that it exercises is on the trade in opium in China, and it becomes a regular source of smuggled opium into China itself. Now, you might well ask, if China is seen as a valuable trading partner, a place where certainly the British and others would like to expand trading opportunities, why engage in a trade which is an anathema to the Chinese government? Why antagonize this regime by trading in a product that they're absolutely opposed to admitting? And the simple answer is the British still had the same problem as other Europeans did, that the Chinese really didn't want to buy a lot of European goods. They weren't interested. On the other hand, as we've seen last week, the British were engaged in this explosive use of tea. And they were buying it, of course, mostly from China. So millions of pounds of tea are being bought in China, as well as silks and porcelains and all other kinds of goods. But the British have very little in the way of products that they can sell in China that are wanted in China. As a result, you have an acute imbalance in trade. Silver is flowing out of the British economy into China to pay for the tea and other products that the Chinese are selling, and to make up for the fact that there is little in the way of exports that the British can provide to the Chinese. So the ideal balancing factor was opium. Opium was being produced in the northeastern reaches of the Indian subcontinent, which is already controlled as a colonial possession by the British. So they could take opium from their colonial possessions in the Indian subcontinent, ship it through the British East India Company to Canton, smuggle it into China, and therefore balance their trade. So the reason for doing this, despite the admonitions of the Chinese government, are simply to balance the trade between China and England. In 1833, we come to the end of the monopoly that the British East India Company had enjoyed. The company is on its last legs. It's essentially collapsing. And as a result, we're going to enter into, I guess, what we would call free trade in opium, in the sense that now virtually any British trader that wanted to take on the trade, and it wasn't just the British, I mean, other European governments were doing it. American merchants were involved in this too, particularly merchants from the East Coast, New England and so forth. They were involved in this trade for the same reason, that gave them a ready opportunity to sell a product in China and then purchase porcelains and other such products from the Chinese. So we now have a more widely distributed smuggling trade in opium as a result of the end of the monopoly of the British East India Company. It is at this very time that the Chinese government is now making a renewed effort to end the opium trade. Its effects are indeed devastating, particularly in southern China, where use is particularly high. And a commissioner is sent to Canton, representing the Chinese government, with orders to essentially close down the trade, one way or another. And he begins seizing shipments of British opium as a demonstration that he's serious about this business, that he is going to bring the opium trade to an end. The response of the British is that But this is a violation of free trade. You can't put these kinds of restrictions on trade. We have a right to trade in the world. And if you don't allow us to engage in free trade, in other words, trade whatever we want, we're going to have to take some action against you. And indeed, the British did. 1839 marks the outbreak of what is called the Opium War. Now, it's a little short of an all-out war that we might imagine occurring in the early 19th century. What much of it consists of are naval bombardments by British vessels against Chinese cities, both along the coast and then also sailing up the major rivers. There are periodic landings of small numbers of troops, but the idea was not that the British were going to invade and occupy China. They obviously knew that that wouldn't be possible. But what they were going to do was inflict enough damage on major urban centers to force the Chinese regime to rethink its policy. And by 1842, it has done precisely that. And it agrees in a treaty to open up a series of ports in China and make them available to the British, but also to other European powers. And indeed, in the years ahead, these so-called treaty ports would come to be dominated. The urban areas themselves were usually dominated by Europeans, with municipal governments that are actually being administered by Europeans. But this does open up China's trade system. And of course, that means it also opens it up to a significant amount of smuggling of opium. And oh, by the way, one of the major concessions is also the concession of Hong Kong. This is where British control of Hong Kong came from for almost a century, was the concession coming out of the Opium War. So now there are a whole series of places where you can, not legally, but where you can bring opium in because they are now open to trade with Europeans. Legally, opium is still prohibited. The opium trade is still prohibited. This will continue into the mid-1850s. In the meantime, once the product is brought in to China, is being brought up its river estuaries, etc., Chinese officials will still seize the opium and declare it to be contraband, to be illegal. When they do that, they run into confrontations with the British, because the British, although there's something odd about this, of course, that the British are saying, you're interfering with the activities of English merchants. You're not allowed to do this. This is a free trade situation. Of course, the English on their own part, if anybody tried to smuggle anything into their country, they're, of course, in the process of making it more and more difficult to do that. But they literally intervene time and again, threaten, intimidate. They use naval vessels to warn off Chinese officials to keep the trade going. Now, after the mid-1850s, China did allow the trade, but under heavy taxation. As a result of the heavy taxation, the smuggling is going to go on as before, because although it's legal, it's now heavily taxed. It's like another product, any other product that has high taxes, like tobacco in England, people are going to smuggle it. In 1907, as the movement has begun to control trade in narcotics, by the early 20th century, and we'll come back and look at this because we're going to look at the drug trade in a separate lecture. By the early 20th century, we do have a movement on by a number of powers, including England, the United States, and others, to control certain substances and the trade of certain substances globally. As that movement starts to pick up steam, the British agree that they will end sales of opium from their possessions in India. It is supposed to occur over a 10-year period from 1907 to 1917. In fact, by 1913, by the outbreak of World War I, the truth is the trade is essentially over. The legal trade is over. There is no official purchase of opium in India anymore for shipment to China. But of course, that doesn't end the opium trade. We have, of course, millions of people in China who are addicted to opium. And many individuals are going to continue to pursue the trade. Of course, it no longer has the legitimacy that it once had under the British, because the British, of course, were protecting traders. They are merchants who are involved in this trade. Now the British are opposed to this. And as a result, as we will see, this is another time when smuggling of this kind of product leads to the penetration of the trade by criminal elements. There's a large criminal element that becomes involved now as the so-called legal trade is eliminated beginning in 1907. Not only that, but we will also see that the smuggling of opium plays a role in internal Chinese politics, because the end of the legal opium trade is coming just at a time when China's own political and social structure are about to be shaken by revolutionary change. And in that process, the opium trade will play a role, as a number of prominent political figures will use the opium trade to try to expand their political control, and opium dealers and traders actually have a significant role to play in supporting one political faction or another. Now, another example of cases where smuggling continued despite free trade involves the existence of free ports. We saw a little bit of this when we talked about the American Revolution. We talked about St. Eustatius as a free port in the Caribbean. And there are a few of these free ports now in the middle of the 19th century. Not a lot of them, because as this process goes on, as the British and then later other European powers and even the United States begin to push for free trade, for the reduction of trade barriers and tariffs and customs duties, etc., the functionality of a free port is diminished, because if there aren't these barriers, in other words, if you don't have to pay duties importing goods to this country or that, well, the idea that you can store your goods someplace and not pay a duty isn't that attractive anymore. So the lower the duty barriers in countries in general, the less attractive a free port is, at least in theory and certainly in practice at this time of the 19th century. However, there was one exception here that was particularly important at this time, and that was Gibraltar. The Rock of Gibraltar, the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula between the Atlantic and Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Gibraltar had been acquired by the British in the 18th century, and by 1801 it was functioning as a free port. And the reason that the British made it a free port was quite simple. It was hoped that its position as a free port would attract large amounts of trade, ships coming and going, sailors, merchants, warehouses, that there would be business generated by the free port that could be taxed, and that would allow the British to pay for their military garrison on this rock, this island, because it doesn't have much else that it could produce in terms of an economy to help support a military garrison. So that was why they had a free port. The significance of Gibraltar as a free port at this time has to do with one particular product, tobacco. Many countries in the world, both then and now, have tobacco monopolies. The government controls the production and the sale of tobacco, and particularly tobacco products, cigarettes in particular, but also cigars, etc. It is an relatively efficient way of collecting revenues, much easier than trying to squeeze money out of peasants or other individual taxpayers. And of course, it is usually viewed again as a bit of an evil or a corrupt habit that people have. So if you establish a monopoly, and of course in establishing a monopoly you inevitably jack up the prices and you're going to charge a lot more, you feel that people will object less to this than some basic essentials that they have to have, like basic foodstuffs. So many countries still have tobacco monopolies, and Spain had a tobacco monopoly. Now Spain, and of course Gibraltar was once part of Spain, therefore they share a common border. The opportunity therefore arose, if you have a free port here, and then right above it, a country not so much with high import duties, but essentially with a ban on a particular product, you can bring the product into the free port for nothing, no import duties, and then it's sitting there without paying any duties, and just on the other side of the border is this place where the price of that product is sky high. An automatic opportunity for smuggling, and we'll see this repeated multiple times in the 20th century. But here the opportunity is that there is this monopoly by the Spanish government, very high prices for tobacco, and so tobacco is smuggled across from Gibraltar into Spain. Now, much of it was originally taken by young men who would put a pack on their back and run across the border, trying to avoid the border guards, and bring it in. However, they quickly developed a more efficient system, which is called the tobacco dogs. And the simple idea was that you raise the dogs on the north side of the border in Spain, fed them up to a certain point, then cut off their food for a day, took them across the border. No law against walking your dog across the border. Put a pack of tobacco on their backs at night, let the dog go. Dog is hungry, dog knows where food is, dog races across the border, back to food, and you take the tobacco off. And of course, the guards are going to have a difficult time shooting the dogs at night. The guards are going to have a hard time finding these dogs at all, much less stopping them or shooting at them. And it became a highly efficient trade of shipping tobacco over into Spain. Now, needless to say, the Spanish became particularly upset, complained to the British government, and finally, in 1888, we have a revision of rules. One is the establishment of re-export bonds, which means you bring tobacco into Gibraltar, you have to sign a bond, put up a bond for 3 times the value of the shipment, guaranteeing that it's going to leave again and that we'll be able to document that it's left here and not gone to Spain. That helps somewhat. Plus, they now require that any tobacco that's going in or out of Gibraltar has to be in 80-pound packs. Why? That means it's much easier to keep an eye on. If you look in a ship and you find any tobacco that isn't in 80-pound packs, immediately you seize the ship. Because the 80-pound packs make it much easier to observe and control. So some simple rules help decrease the trade, although smuggling continues nonetheless. India was another spot where the British had significant problems with smuggling. One of their problems was the Portuguese colony of Goa that is on the Indian subcontinent. Its taxes and tariffs are much lower than those in the British colony of India. So what the British did was they began subsidizing the Portuguese government in Goa. So it would raise its taxes and tariffs and therefore diminish the smuggling between Goa and India. And that occurred during the 19th century. However, despite that, smuggling continued in part because the British, the great advocates of free trade, they themselves had a monopoly in India, and in this case, the salt monopoly. Salt is absolutely essential for preservation of food, therefore it's needed by everyone in the society, great way to generate revenue for the government. However, it was also true that you could get salt much more cheaply across the borders in places like Goa, and even within India. There were varying prices, and that there were sources of salt other than those generated by the monopoly. So you had a constant smuggling of this product in India. Why does it occur? Because the British are not following their own free trade ideas here. Here, instead, they've established a monopoly. Perhaps the most troubling of smuggling issues in the 19th century was the continuation of the slave trade. England had abolished the slave trade, declared it illegal in 1803. And in the next several decades, the British did conduct a very serious campaign to wipe out the slave trade, not only by their own subjects, but by anyone. They were trying to bring the slave trade, particularly the slave trade along the west coast of Africa, where many Europeans and Americans were involved, to an end. And they acted vigorously to reduce the amount of slaving that went on internationally at this time. However, by the middle of the 19th century, there is still a significant trade in slavery, in slaves, as much as it may be illegal, because there are huge areas of demand. The American South, Brazil, both plantation economies, cotton, coffee. Also in the Middle East, where it had been going on for several thousand years. In India, there's a significant slave trade. Cuba, also in the Western Hemisphere, another case of a plantation economy, sugar, a huge demand for slaves. Most of the areas in the Western Hemisphere got their slaves from the African West Coast. And although the British had officially outlawed it, nevertheless, people like a man named Philip Duke, a U.S. citizen, continued to engage in the trade. He took on the enticing title Don Felipe Drax, pretending he was some kind of Spanish nobleman. In fact, he was a petty trader involved in the buying and selling of thousands of human beings. In fact, he kept a small island that he owned in the Caribbean, stocked with thousands of slaves, who he would then sell off to planters in the American South and to Cuba in particular. Part of the problem in controlling the trade is that with steamships, as much as steamships help enforcement against smuggling, including slavery, they also make it possible for slavers to carry large cargoes of human beings, for them to maneuver easily along the coast, and therefore hit not just the major ports where they might acquire slaves, but all kinds of river inlets. This is particularly true along the Niger River Delta, where Nigeria is now on the west coast of Africa, below the Great Hump of Africa, was a major location because of all the river estuaries in the area where you could go and move in and pick up slaves from slave traders. As far as the west coast, the east coast of Africa, the British successfully begin the suppression of the slave trade on the east coast of Africa, involving people in the Middle East and people in India. In 1873, they force a treaty on Zanzibar requiring the end of slave trading in their region, and this was one of the major outposts for trade on the east coast of Africa, and this begins a rapid reduction in that trade. As far as the west coast, other factors intervene here to help reduce the trade. Most importantly, perhaps, is the American Civil War, because with the end of the American Civil War, we have the end of slavery in the United States, and this was one of the largest markets. Furthermore, it was a strong support, shall we say, for the continuation of the slave trade in Cuba and Brazil, because American slave traders ensured that the U.S. government would frown upon any British effort to totally wipe out slavery in Cuba and Brazil. So first, the American market disappears with the American Civil War. Then American pressure to preserve slavery in the Western Hemisphere disappears. And partly due to that, but mostly due to British pressure, slavery is abolished in the late 1880s in both Cuba and Brazil. So the slave trade ends largely in the Western Hemisphere because, and therefore on the west coast of Africa, because the markets are disappearing with the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery in both Cuba and Brazil. The three major markets in the Western Hemisphere, within a matter of just over 2 decades, have disappeared completely, and therefore the trade will drop dramatically. Does it ever disappear? No. There is slave trading going on today in the world. In Africa, Asia, there are people who are enslaved in places like Brazil and other parts of the world. They may have different names for it, but that's what it is. It's slavery. But it has been radically reduced and was radically reduced by the end of the 19th century. The one other area of significant smuggling is in the arms trade in Africa. As I mentioned earlier, African societies at this time were under pressure, being conquered by European powers. They were disintegrating after centuries of the infliction of the damages of the slave trade, mass migrations and disruptions of populations, wars being conducted for the simple purpose of acquiring slaves. In all of this, weapons became a vital element in attempts to overthrow governments, to carry out slave trading and wars for slaves. And as a result, Europe found an enormous market for arms. And despite the fact that this trade had been technically banned, particularly by the British, the fact is that it flourished during the 19th century, and about 40,000 rifles, for example, were being sold in Africa every year in the 19th century. And until the imposition of colonial control over all of Africa, and by the end of the 19th century, the trade would continue to flourish. So what have we got? In the 19th century, we have, overall, in the world's economy, a significant decline in smuggling and piracy. First of all, because of the spread of free trade, which reduces price differentials, which reduces one of the major incentives for smuggling. You know, if there's no import duty on a product, why bother smuggling it into the country? Changes in trade. The transportation revolution leading to a vast increase in the shipment of bulk goods, so that in the 19th century, 90% of world trade is made up of bulk agricultural products like sugar and cotton, or bulk industrial goods, steel products, etc. These aren't products that you can readily pirate or smuggle and make a fortune out of. You need high-value, low-volume goods, and these are not it. Bulk products reduce smuggling. The modern state, Britain and other states acquiring enormous powers, both military and naval, that allow them, as well as modern bureaucracies, that allow them to more effectively enforce bans on smuggling. And this spreads with the spread of European colonialism, as they are able to enforce to some degree such rules in places like Africa. At the same time, smuggling is not disappearing. It's declining. We've seen the Opium War in China, arms in Africa. There are places at the periphery where smuggling or piracy is still significant. In a few minutes, we're going to come back and look at the outstanding exception in this period of declining smuggling, and that is prohibition in the United States in the 20th century.